Hello, everyone, and welcome to At Matters podcast presented by The Outer Loop, where we create art that matters. My name is Melissa Wilson. I'm the Inter-Enso facilitator and marketing director for The Outer Loop. And here on At Matters, we like to create a space to explore the question, what are we here to do, through the lens of art for social change. Here with me today, I have Rachael Yoder, our artistic director.
Hello. Happy to be
Yay.
here.
And before we jump into our topic, as always, we're going to start with our little 5 things game. If you're new to the podcast, 5 things is an improv game that's just supposed to get us set for whatever we're going to be talking about for the rest of the episode. So I'll toss my category to you first. I want you to share with me 5 things that are just like part of your daily routine.
5 things that are part of my daily routine. I'm laughing because I feel like my daily routines have like gotten a little unwieldy. Like it's like there's too many of them, and it's like, all right, but that's like the whole day can't be routines. Like you have to have space for flexibility. But so yeah, I can list them off. The first one is morning pages. That's like a ritual that I've had for over a decade. So that one's very important to me. If you don't know The Artist's Way, everyone listening, you should go check it out and do your own morning pages. Just the having of the coffee in silence before that happens is also very important. And what's great about that is that, Michael and I have been together for a really long time now. So we both understand that like there's no speaking before the coffee portion of the morning.
Good.
So that works out. So yeah, coffee and morning pages. I do like a little bit of a physical warm up every morning. It's like a combination of, I do a little bit of yoga and then I do a little bit of Fitzmaurice tremor work, which looks insane. To anyone who hasn't seen that, it looks like I'm having a seizure, but it's an important part of my morning.
Good.
Daily walks are a really important part of my routine. It's something I liked doing anyway, but that's also kind of borrowed from The Artist's Way. She just talks about the importance of walking, and I find traditional meditation pretty challenging, so more of a moving meditation practice like walking I find just suits my mind and body a little bit better. And also hydrating is an important part.
Good.
My daily routine. Like I probably drink like close to a gallon of like water or seltzer combination a day.
That you do.
I sure do, as you are well aware from having traveled with me.
It's true.
And the results of that.
Yep.
The constant going to the bathroom.
Yes.
Oh, nice. Yes,
Amazing.
those are my 5 things.
Good job.
Okay, for you, I would love for you to share with us 5 things that you learned from conducting the Empathy Project interviews. And just like a quick little recap for anyone listening who doesn't know what that is, Melissa conducted over 30 interviews with people of very different political perspectives recently for a new project that she's leading that we're working on at The Outer Loop. So I would love to hear 5 things that you learned from that experience.
Great. So the first thing that is coming to mind is I learned a like perspective around gun ownership, around like corrupt and dictatorial governments in the past, that a way that they've been able to take power is because civilians didn't have guns, and so that's like a reason that people are in favor of gun rights, among many. That was something I didn't know. I have learned that people on both sides of like whoever you're voting for presidentially feel that their candidate is like the best for us economically, but also like the reverse of that being that the other candidate just wants to make the rich richer, poor poorer. I didn't realize that was something that was on both sides. Something else that I learned is people use the word like priority very differently. I had one of the non-political questions was like, what's your highest priority in life? And people took that from anywhere to like, from like sleep to like taking care of family and everything in between. So that was interesting. What else? There's so much. I learned the power of like asking follow-up questions and like leaving kind of awkward silency space, because frequently the best, most like truthful answers I would get from people were when I would go, do you have anything else to say about that? And then they would go, no. And then they would say something like, no, I just think that. And then go off on like a whole nother 5 minutes of talking about something that was like the best piece of the interview. So that was super useful. And then another thing that I learned was how to take better use of like starting to learn to use AI for certain like transcription-y things. That's like very outside of my comfort zone, but I've been working on using that more. So yeah.
Nice. Yeah, that's an old reporter trick, that silence, leaving until people feel uncomfortable and then they want to say more.
Yep. Yep.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yay. Awesome. Well, what we want to talk about today, we're going to transition us into our episode topic. It's something that we hit on, I think, in an earlier episode. And then we kind of flagged it for, let's follow up on that. Let's have a whole episode about that. Just wanted to talk about moments in our respective lives, or that we've witnessed in other people's lives, where our perspectives broadened in some way, where there was some sort of experience of, oh, hey, wow, what I thought was the world, or what I thought was how things are is not the whole picture, is not the whole story. And look, there's this other thing that I hadn't even really considered. So those sort of like mind explosion moments where you're like, oh, wow, I didn't even realize that this was a thing. So we just want to spend some time with that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I thought it could be helpful to start with like things that have been close to home for us and then maybe slowly like work our way outwards. So a story that came to mind for me as I was thinking about this episode is there's a like study, I guess, that I did with a few other people from my school through my like campus ministry. I think it was my freshman year of college. And it was the study was about like race and culture in America and like what our kind of duty is within all of the discrimination that happens. But the very first week, as we were all just getting to know each other and everything, we did this like long form icebreaker. I don't know what to call it, but basically where there was a series of like 5 questions and we went around and it was questions like, what did dinner look like every night for at your household? What were holiday traditions that happened and all these sorts of things? Because there were maybe 10 of us. Most of us were from Washington State. I think most of the people in the group were white, just happened to be that way. We were all going to the same college. So there's like a lot of things already in common. But to see even within all of these people who are from the same place, the wide range of differences in just these simple ways that we live our lives that we may never have thought about, like, oh, I guess maybe not everybody like eats dinner at the same time every night with their family, or maybe not everybody, gets takeout every night. Like, who knows? There are just so many different ways that these things can happen that are so ingrained in who we are as people that we don't even think about. And so I think that that was a super helpful and like perspective broadening way to start then like 3-month study of examining these much like larger cultural questions. Was to start with like, whoa, even just the 10 people in this room have so many cultural differences, and just what an interesting thing that was.
That is interesting. That reminds me of, have you ever, I don't really want to call it a game, but like, have you ever done that exercise, I guess, where it's a privilege exercise and it's kind of like step forward if this, step forward if that, with a group of people?
No.
It's kind of similar to what you were just describing, and it's I've seen it done in like large groups, and everybody kind of lines up at the back of the room, and then there are like a series of questions, and they all speak to some sort of like privilege in some way, like, take a step forward if you've ever like gone to bed hungry because there wasn't enough food on the table, things like that. And then at the end you're left with this like visual representation of everybody's like varying degrees of privilege throughout their life. And that exercise it really only works if you've kind of been with a group for a while so that people kind of trust each other and they're able to like disclose some of that stuff. But it can be a really powerful eye opener and like, oh, wow. Like, and some of the questions even are surprising. It's like, wow, I didn't even realize that that one was related to a privilege that I wasn't
Mm,
even aware that it was something that I had.
yeah.
Until you see, and then you kind of look around the room and you're like, oh, whoa. And, you know, I think everybody comes in with their own idea of how privileged they think they are, and then you kind of look around and you're like, oh, maybe it's a little bit different than I thought it was. So that kind of reminds me of that exercise. It's just so interesting, you know, you just the things that looking at people, we make assumptions, or you know, we assume, oh, that person like has it all together or has all these advantages, and then you don't know until you dig into their background a little bit how different things were.
Mhm.
Super interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, when you sort of when you were talking about that, you know, wanting to start close to home, something that's like a sort of a recent example for me of this is that I mean, I'm very much guilty of the putting myself in a bubble and like an echo chamber um sort of sin that some of us find ourselves in, that like obviously became apparent I think for a lot of people around 2016 and that election cycle, and just like, oh wow, I really thought this was going to go a different way, because that was kind of what I was hearing. But um in the somewhat recent past, I started working in the nuclear power industry doing corporate facilitation work. And that was a very different audience for me. And
Mm,
suddenly I was very outside of my bubble and exposed to people who had not only a very different work environment, but very different background, very different life experience. A lot of people who find their way to the nuclear power sector come from the military, because the Navy has a very strong nuclear program. So I had not been exposed to previously like this many people from a military background. So that was very different. And there were varying political perspectives and things. And so finding myself at, you know, kind of get to know you dinners and things with people of suddenly very different life experiences. And what's interesting is I sort of felt like a little bit of like this weird alien, like outsider person that is suddenly like immersed in everybody else's of a different culture and a different, you know, mindset than I'm used to, but speaking to me as if, you know, right? Like, of course, we all think the same thing. And I'm finding myself, you know, multiple times like, I don't actually feel that way, but I, my entire work with these groups is about empathy and listening and communication and, you know, opening your mind to somebody else's different experience. And so finding myself kind of on the receiving end of that. And this one person in particular who was expressing some pretty strong political views that I pretty strongly disagreed with, but then he started speaking about his own history in the military, and particularly coming back from his deployment, and just like entering back in a culture where he felt like no one respected his service at all, and that he felt like he had, you know, put his life on the line and was going through this, like, you know, the horrors of where he was stationed, and then coming back and feeling like people here despised him, and thinking, you know, he went into this deep depression of, you know, what was it for if nobody even respects my service in the same way. And so that, like, hearing that story in particular of like, had to challenge myself to think, yeah, what would that feel like? And I've been pretty critical of the military, particularly the United States military, and have my own opinions about it. But then listening to this person on the other side, you know, talk about their lived experiences, like, oh yeah, what would that feel like? You know, so um, yeah, I mean, it all goes back to just, you know, listening to each other, and you don't know what you don't know, unless you're willing to take that in, and to not shut it down, and to just think, wow, yeah, what would it be like to be them?
mhm. Wow, that's a powerful experience. Yeah.
Mm.
And I think like the next thing on my list was like, whoa, okay, how does this work nationally? And I think that what you were saying was like, whoa, that's close to home, but that's also plays so well into our national perspective that it's like depending on geographically where you live, or just like you were saying, these echo chambers that we put ourselves in, um, like being like, oh, of course so and so is going to win the election because everyone I know is voting for them. Like, so that's just everyone, and having such such interesting perspectives. Or even I remember I one of my close friends, their dad, when they were growing up, worked in a coal mine. They were from kind of like Midwest area, and we were then going to college together in Washington. Washington has all these like wind turbines and everything, and my friend being like, "Oh yeah, like the like knee jerk reaction of a thought that goes through my head when I drive past a wind turbine is what a waste of money."
Hmm.
And I was like, whoa, that's not something I've heard before being from Washington. But it's like, no, if your dad works in a coal mine, like that's your world. Like that's so important to you. And like whatever you believe about coal or about wind power or whatever these things, like, whoa, those are two radically different perspectives that we were raised in, you know, just by nature of living like two states away from each other.
Hmm.
And that's wild.
Hmm. Yeah, and that is always interesting too, of like when you come up against these moments that are these perspective broadening moments. I think it's always an invitation to just challenge your own belief systems, even just for a moment, even if you wind
Yeah.
up at the same place where you started, of like, where did I get this idea? You know, did this come organically from me, or like what factors of my environment made me feel this way that I feel about this thing? And is there an alternate option here? And do I still firmly believe what I believe? And let me hear a little bit more about that and see if I am open to widening my perspective on this a little bit. Because I think we all, especially, you know, you hit on um, something that's a very hot button thing. You know, energy is a hot button thing, and where we get our energy, and is it clean energy, and is it sustainable, and you know, whatever. That's all stuff that, you know, there's like little triggers in there for everybody. So I think it's always an interesting invitation when you hit up against those things to go, oh yeah, like where did I get that idea, and do I still even, is that even mine, you know, or did I just like download that from my environment?
Right. Yeah, no, I think about sometimes I'll come up against things just like anything in my life where I'll be like, when did I learn that? Like, I don't remember learning this piece of information. And a lot of those things are like, it could be the most basic of facts. Like, some sweaters have hoods and some sweaters don't. Like, at some point in my life, I didn't know that and I had to learn. But then it's also facts like this that it's like, oh, like I just know for a fact that's not even something I have to think about when it like enters my vision that X, Y, and Z is a waste of time, is a waste of money, or is a good thing, is a good use of resources, whatever that may be. And yeah, having to analyze like, wait, where did I get that from? Who did I get that from? Um, I I there's a comedian I like named Daniel Sloss, and he has this one bit where he's talking about like how we have these outdated opinions,
Hmm.
and sometimes, there's just like this like file folder of all the things that we think in our head, and some files just like have not gotten pulled out in a while because we haven't seen X, Y, and Z in a while. And then we see something and the thought that pops into our head, it's like, wait, do I still believe that? Like, wait, maybe I need to like fact check myself of like there's just really interesting internal processes, I think, that happen because our brains contain so much information, especially the older we get. um I don't know, I feel like I'm rambling now, but I just think
No,
it's so
that's so true.
interesting.
That's so true. And it is like, when you described that experience, I've definitely had that experience. And like sometimes I'm not even, it's coming out of my mouth is when I'm realizing it. I'm like saying a thing that I'm like, what am I, do I,
Right.
what did I just say? Where did that come from? And do I still believe that? Where did I get that belief? So and it's hard, I think, you know, outside of any sort of, you know, if you're not in any kind of formal structure, like I guess I would say that, you know, where I sit right now is like, you know, I spent so many years in school, and then, you know, going back to when I finished undergrad, I went to conservatory. When I finished conservatory, I went to grad school. So like I was in school forever. And so when you're in a system like that, or you're in a certain job environment, like there are certain like external factors that will like force you to update certain processes because you're constantly being inundated with like structured new information. But I think, you know, a lot of us, when we're outside of like, you know, an educational setting or some sort of like formal training setting, or like seeking out new input, it can be hard to like remember how to update those files and when to update those files. You have to constantly be actively seeking out new information in order to update that stuff. And I think I've certainly seen a lot of people who it's like, wow, yeah, I haven't had like an iOS upgrade in a quite a long time, and they say like constantly outdated opinions. And it's, especially as I get older, I recognize that more and more in myself of like, oops, that's something I haven't updated. And like, I need to, because it's work, right? And it's hard, it's uncomfortable, and it makes us look silly or feel stupid if we say something. And then it's like, oh, I just won't do any more learning and I'll just be an ostrich. And then I won't have to feel awkward or embarrassed again because I said something wrong. Yeah, so I just think it can be hard to remember to seek out those perspective broadening experiences that do challenge our own beliefs, and to even know where to find it. There's such an oversaturation of information that it can be hard to um and it's easy to curate your own information stream to be just information that you already agree with.
Right. Right.
Which I
Yeah.
do think, to where you started us with the, nationally, politically, where we're at right now. Certainly I saw that a lot in 2016 of like people were like blindsided by the way that went because of the echo chambers. I think now there's a little bit more awareness of like, hey, like I should be paying attention to perspectives other than my own in order to get like a real sense of what's happening. But to some degree, I do still think we're quite siloed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely true. And I think to tie it back into art and all of that, I think that that's such a like beautiful and really, really hard part of our job as artists is to recognize that there's such breadth of perspective in our country. It's such a large country with people from so many cultures. Um, and to recognize that it's our job to help begin to reconcile some of that, to help represent the different experiences in ways that are digestible for people so that people can have those resources when they're not in school and all those sorts of things. I always say like people will go to see a play that they won't about something they won't read a book or an article about, or they won't know someone who experiences like, so then that's a lot of responsibility on us to aid in the perspective broadening journey of our nation.
I agree. And I think it's something that, I think we talk about it as a company pretty regularly, but maybe not enough. Is like, that's actually something that I get quite frustrated with regularly about, I would say particularly theater, and theater in the United States, is that I think we don't always do as good a job as we can of, first of all, making art about very different perspectives and including all perspectives in that art making process, and then being intentional about broadening our audience and making sure. I think a lot of the times the theater going audience tends to be the same. I think a lot of that is tied up in, just like cultural, what you grew up with, which is tied to privilege, which is tied to the price points of theater, I think are very problematic. And I think there's like huge access issues. So a lot of times you're preaching the choir's story to the choir, and that's not helpful. Versus I think there are some pieces of theater or, avenues of art that do challenge us a little bit to think outside of our own echo chambers. I think I've talked about this maybe on this podcast before, but the one play that comes to mind in particular is Heroes of the Fourth Turning, which I think you definitely need to read. But it's what Will Arbery has done with that play is he's giving us four characters that are very outside of the traditional theater going audience and like way outside, and we're sitting with that for 90 minutes, and that's not something I see often. And we have to just kind of grapple with that and deal with that. So I think that, writers like that and, or theater artists, and I know it's something that's important to us, who take the theater outside of the theater and perform in non-traditional spaces or like invite different audiences in very intentionally in order to do that perspective broadening work. Because I think, sometimes as artists, it's easy for us to get comfortable too. And it's just like, well, I like this play and I'm going to do this play for my friends who I also know are going to like it. And then we're all going to pat ourselves on the back and
Yeah.
nobody's going to learn anything, you know?
Yeah. 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 It's a lot. It's a lot. Like it's a big responsibility. Yeah. I would love to chat a little bit now, like widening even further to like a global perspective. Um, I know we've talked a lot about like Tanzania and how that's impacted each of our purposes and perspectives and all of that. Um, but I would love just like within the context of this conversation, to hear how that like global perspective broadening has impacted you.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting conversation, right? Because I think that there's a little bit of a fallacy that we have, that there's this assumption that just because travel has taken place, that perspective broadening has also taken place. And I don't actually think that those things are always synonymous or one and the same. I think there are a lot of people who have traveled to a lot of places who haven't actually done that perspective widening work. And I think it's has a lot to do with the way that you travel and like what you expose yourself to. Um, there's a way to very easily shield yourself from whatever culture it is that you're visiting, and just kind of like making your own little, I'm speaking, I guess, specifically to Americans, but your own little like American bubble that just follows you around, and like you don't actually have to, be porous and open. So that's part of it. But I also think that, there has to be a humility when you travel, of, hey, there's another way and I'm open to experiencing another way, fully, even if that makes me uncomfortable. So I mean, in particular, I'm thinking about Tanzania, but I'm thinking in terms of, we've brought a lot of different people with us, and I've seen people enter into that experience like so open-hearted, open-minded, like, wow, I'm learning so much. I'm like really seeing how things are different here and how people way of life is different, customs are different, culture is different. Um, the world is like so much wider than I imagined. And I've seen that. And I've also seen people kind of assume that they knew what it was when they went in and like keep the blinders on the whole time and then come out with the same opinion they came in with. And I don't really see them change at all. Um, so all of that to say, I think that, it's work to widen your perspective. And if you're going to travel with the intention of widening your perspective, I think that you need to take some time to determine what that means for how you show up in that environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'm constantly like in awe of how powerful our brains are and how much we can do to control the directions that goes. We have all this like neuroplasticity and all these sorts of things that we're learning about, but there's the negative sides of that, that it's like if I decide that this is what the world is and I'm not open to any other experience, then whether I'm just driving in my neighborhood, whether I'm, flying across the country, or, whether I'm going around the world, so many things can happen around me and I can be virtually unaffected. Like my opinion of what the world is can stay the same. And that's really scary. Like how
Mm.
intentional, like the fact that I have to be intentional to fly across the world to Tanzania, see someone, struggling in a way that I can't even fathom and that I have to choose to allow that to impact the way I see the world is a little bit scary.
Mm-hmm.
Like it feels like that should just happen automatically, but it doesn't. We get that choice. And yeah, that's a lot.
It is a lot. And I think that something that, we were kind of joking about, we were joking about when we looked at the raw footage of your vlog, because we're like, oh, were you tired, Melissa? Like,
Yeah.
like most of it is like, I'm so tired. But I think part of the exhaustion, I mean, yes, we're on the equator. Yes, it is hot. Yes, like we have very busy days. Like, yes, all of those factors do lead up to tired. But I think part of what makes that experience tiring when you're entering into it in the way that we're speaking about is that it it's like feeling on steroids, because you're taking in, if you're really going to take in the experience of people around you and think, and empathize truly, and think like, what would it be like to be in this situation? What would it be like to be in this environment? What would it be like for me? What if I was born here? What would my life look like? What would my daily challenges be? And witnessing that like really through your heart, that's draining, because there's a lot of feelings and emotionality that come with, processing that experience, not only up here but also in your heart, and that's exhausting. Change is hard work, and it takes time, and it's uncomfortable, and it's tiring. So it is a little bit taxing, especially, when we're talking about a very extreme environment like Tanzania. um I know for me, I've probably talked about this before, but the first trip in particular, that being my first experience with absolute poverty, just witnessing absolute poverty versus, relative poverty that we see here in the States, is like, it is an overwhelming experience to take in emotionally, and to just imagine and to witness what that's like, and how dangerous that is, to have literally no safety net at any given point. You're just like one step away from a million different kinds of danger at all moments. And thinking all the things that leads up to, you're living with this heightened level of awareness, which means you have like higher levels of cortisol at every minute of every day. So you're just like constantly in fight or flight. And then what that does to you, and what that does to sleep, and just like all of it, it's so much to take in and process, that I understand why it's hard for people to want to engage with that.
Totally. Totally. Yeah. No, I think back, the first time that I feel like I experienced that was on a trip to the Dominican Republic that I took with my family. I think in 2021, 2022. And yeah, we were there to like install water filters and stuff in this village. And yeah, just realizing like, A, what a big and yet small world this is, in that in one planet there can be such ridiculous breadth of experience.
Hmm.
Like what living on Earth means for two different people can be so mind-bogglingly different. Um, but then on top of that, how much it's like, and yet this person is not that different from me. Like
Hmm.
our experiences can be polar opposites, and yet who we are, the things we think are funny or sweet or heartbreaking, are the same. We're all, think it's adorable when a little kid says something stupid, and we all, think it's tragic and want to go help him when he trips or whatever.
Hmm.
Um, and then along with that, just realizing the, um, okay, like while we were there, we were talking to this guy who was like, one of kind of the central figures of their village, and we were talking to him and his wife. Um, except they weren't actually like technically married, because in that country and that like under that government, it is like financially impossible for people that live at that level to get married when
Hmm.
it comes to like what the government um sees as marriage, like
Hmm.
civil marriage.
Hmm.
Um and this guy was like, he was a pastor, like in that culture, in that like faith culture, marriage as a what is the word I'm looking for? Marriage is a very big deal and is very important, and the fact that like, but it's actually impossible.
Hmm.
Like, and so for him to figure out like, okay, what does this look like for me if I went to America and was living under their like rules of how my religion is supposed to work, I would be doing something wrong, but that's actually impossible in my context. And
Hmm.
that was just like super humbling for me to
Hmm.
witness.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, sometimes we don't even realize the barriers that are in people's way until they sort of speak to their experience, and it's like, I didn't even know that was something, I've never had
Yeah.
to even conceive of that barrier.
Right.
So that fact that that's somebody's lived experience is, yeah, kind of mind-boggling.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would love for us to zoom out one last time. We're not going to go universal perspective broadening in case
What
you were
is it like
nervous.
another planet?
um, but to talk about like in time, like
Hmm.
perspective, this earth has been around for a lot longer than we have. And so like how is it perspective broadening to look at how things have been done in the past, how things maybe have been done in the future in comparison to
Hmm.
right now?
Yeah, I love that question, especially in concert with what you just shared about like yes, some things are so different in our lived experience of human beings on the planet Earth and human beings in time. Obviously, time changes so many variables for what lived experience is. And yet that is something that I love about particularly like theater that endures for a very long time, like Shakespeare or even like Ibsen, sort of playwrights and plays and stories that have been around for a long time. I am always struck by how little has changed when I witness something like that, and how the sort of underlying human struggles are the same through time, obviously so much around us has changed, but particularly with Shakespeare, I very recently, Chicago Shakespeare did an incredible version of Richard III that felt very poignant, very now. And you're watching it and you're seeing the same sort of power dynamics play out, political machinations play out that we're still dealing with, the human drive for power and how that corrupts the human soul playing out in exactly the same ways that we see it around us all the time. So the sort of timelessness of some struggles always hits me with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think I was talking last week with Tiffany, one of our coworkers, and I was like expressing frustration with how people are always saying these like, ah, well, it's worse than it's ever been. Like, we have it so much harder, all these yada, yada, yada. Um, and I was like, I don't know why, but I just don't really feel like that's true. And um, we were talking specifically about just like um, things that are just people kind of glorifying obviously negative behaviors, I guess,
Mm.
in our culture. Um, and she was like, yeah, back in the days of like the ancient Romans, they were like gathering in stadiums, and instead of watching football, they were watching people burn at the stake. And they were like watching people get brutally murdered by animals. And they were like, yes, so excited, like we are about football now, and like the things that we struggle with are, like things haven't changed in a lot of ways. Like that is so much worse in some ways, and other things that we do are maybe worse in other ways. And like we humanity is just as beautiful and also just as broken
Hmm.
and in need of healing as it has ever been.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it used to be, but now it's like you get sort of like crucified on TikTok, but it used to be like royalty was just straight up beheading people
Right.
publicly. So
Yes.
it's
Yes. There used to be actual crucifixion, like
yeah,
where
that
it
was
actually
like
came from.
that was the thing that we were doing
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
humans. Yeah.
Not super cool.
No,
Not super
definitely
cool.
not. No, and in a lot of ways, yeah, things have changed and evolved. And in a lot of ways, the human experience is the human experience. We're sort of constantly struggling with these same issues over and over again, which is kind of, I think that's sort of the um it's like the only musical I ever reference, but like the Hades Town metaphor of like, yeah, like we're gonna tell the story over, which is another enduring story. The Greek myths, enduring
Totally.
story for a reason is like there are these certain just like lessons that for some reason as a human race we just gotta keep relearning and keep relearning no matter how much growth and progress we do make.
It's true. It's a little sad sometimes.
Mm.
But there's also like I think it can be, sometimes I get so like, wow, it really sucks right now. And to look back and be like, wow, but people were having joy and like creating beautiful art thousands of years ago when we were just as much on the struggle bus. And yet there were these beautiful things that came out of that time. So that can be true of our time as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, when Michael and I get in these conversations a lot, and he usually winds up on the side of like, everything's terrible. And I'm just sort of like, well, but so what are you going to do? I mean, if you give up and you don't do anything to kind of make things better, then you definitely lose. We all lose. So that seems pointless. So you might as well try to move an inch,
Mhm.
every day, or whatever the case may be. Um, so you don't get despondent, because I think that's really, the backward sliding forces winning, is if the people who have the energy to move our society forward give up and feel like there's no point.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. This was a good conversation. I
It
have a
was. I
lot to
hope we
think
didn't
about.
leave it on a downer for everybody.
Whoops. Um yeah, no, but this was good. I think I have a lot to think about, so I hope our audience also like has a lot to think about coming out of this. Um yeah, thank you guys so much for listening to us just wax poetic about perspective for the last 40 minutes. And yeah, we'll be back next Thursday. We're here wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on social media. There's a lot of really cool things happening. Rachel's sweater might be one of them. She's got her
Oh,
Talk Hard
teasing up the
merch
Talk
on.
Hard merch. If you're listening to the pod and you can't see my sweatshirt, then
Yep.
you should check out Talk Hard, especially if you're in Chicago. We are launching officially on October 7th. Very exciting. First Monday of every month. So do be sure to check that out. And our call to action for this episode is just to I'd like to challenge you to find one way that you can broaden your own perspective this week. And we'd love for you to share whatever that way is with us. You can send
Mhm.
us an email at podcast@outerlooptheater.org. We would love to hear from you.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we will see you next week.
See you next week. Bye.
Bye.